Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and PR consultant Alex Dean. So let's see what is on some of those front pages. Well, The Times looks ahead to the government's 10-year defence plan set to be announced next week. With a commitment, Britain will spend 3% of GDP, as without it, the plan is unaffordable. The defence plan also leads The Guardian, reporting it's set to warn of the pressing danger posed by Russia and the changing nature of warfare to include drones and artificial intelligence. And to combat that, The Eye reports cyber experts are set to serve on the front line of the British military to scramble enemy signals and take down drones. Meanwhile, the Financial Times reports on NatWest returning to private hands after the government sells the last of its shares in the bank. The Daily Mail leads with increasing pressure on Sir Keir Starmer to sack his Attorney General for comparing the Tories and reform to Nazis. The Telegraph reports benefit claims by households with at least one foreign national have doubled to nearly $1 billion a month in the past 3 years. The Sun says the Southport murderer, Axel Rudukubana, can still buy treats in jail despite attacking a guard with boiling water. On the front of the Mirror, Wyn Evans has been axed from his Wales radio show due to scandals while on Strictly. And The Express leads on confusion for residents in North Wales over an increasing number of rubbish bins. Got to get the right one, otherwise it doesn't work. We're joined tonight by Zoe and Alex. Thank you so much for being with us. So the Strategic Defence Review, which we are expecting to be announced, it seems from the papers, on Monday, leading a lot of the front pages. A lot of articles about the change in the nature of the threat. But if we start with The Times, their main point is the money. 3% of GDP, now no longer an ambition, but a certainty. Alex, you want to start us off with that?
The Strategic Defence Review, in a piece of work being led by George Robertson, former Member of Parliament and Secretary of State in this country, then, of course, head of NATO, comes out with some very significant conclusions for the future of our country and the threat that it faces. And a number of the newspapers tomorrow carry the point that our Defence Secretary, John Healey, now says that whilst people have much discussed 3% of GDP going to defence, that will now be government policy and it will happen in the next Parliament, with defence spending rising to that point so it reaches it by 2034.
Zoe?
I mean, the thing is, if you look at the Times story, their question is whether or not Healey's trying to bounce the Treasury into agreeing or whether the Treasury has already agreed. Now, that's a kind of classic Westminster way to look at it. You know, they're pausing everything for how much is actually a certainty when the Defence Secretary says it's a certainty. But, I mean, the government does have a problem with its spending commitments because it hasn't had a major policy that it hasn't significantly changed since it came into power. And granted, I mean, it's only been a year, but it has only been a year. It shouldn't. That shouldn't.
It's a fair point.
Be true.
If you think about the big things they've done that would save money, Winterfuel announced huge political cost, and then rode back on very little political credit, having made the pledge. So why they rode back in some ways? Do you think the pensioners are grateful to you now? Right? Then the private schools.
Yeah, exactly. You've just made them angry. They're like hornets.
The private schools one, the kids wind up in the state school system, so that costs more if you can find them a place. So where they are, the capital gains one lost them money because ultra-wealthy people left more. So they haven't really made a huge amount of cash to put into the system, and she's bound up by the pledges she made not to increase taxes on working people. So the one thing they've said that will get them to this point by 2027 on the curve of defence spending is taking money from the foreign aid budget, which was not popular on the left, but at least does get you there. But how do you get from 2027 the rest of the way? That's the challenge for government.
Yeah, exactly. And I disagree with some of your analysis. I don't think there's any evidence at all that putting VAT on private schools has actually cost more money or indeed put the state sector under pressure because they were kind of...
the schools are closing.
They were... The private schools? No, that's not costing the government money, though, is it? And
also, where do you think the kids go?
There was excess capacity in the state system. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is not one of like what's costed how, but there does seem to be a very, very high tolerance in Treasury for saying, "Oops, we can't afford it."
Yeah,
and
fair.
that's quite a bad look.
I suppose you could argue, though, that the world has changed a lot, security-wise,
yeah.
obviously, to say the least. There's a NATO summit coming up as well. So, I mean, we're seeing a whole change in a way of security in Europe. And so if we look at your paper, Zoe, The Guardian, front page there, a new era of threat. Because that's the whole point, that, you know, we have to change the way that the armed forces work.
I mean, it's quite interestingly written, this story, because they do. It does seem to suggest that Russia is the only openly hostile nation, which has these kind of new eras of security, has these kind of new security threats for which they speak. But they talk about China as a rising challenge. They talk about Iran and North Korea. And
sophisticated and persistent challenge.
Yeah,
a phrase I think will be remembered.
And I think the problem with this kind of story is that it's vague enough that it's impossible to sketch out the limits and reaches of what this new threat is. So obviously it's really, really plausible that drones will be an increasing threat. Obviously it's really possible that hacking and cyber attacks are on the rise. I mean, we've seen it with supermarkets. If teenagers can get into Marks and Spencer's, then sure as hell the Russians can get into your military system. But it doesn't have a ceiling. You can't say, well, this is going to cost yay much more. It just looks incredibly insecure and terrifying.
Well, there is also an interesting disconnect between some of the ambitions in the defence environment and broader national targets, because the NATO summit you mentioned has been openly trailed by the Secretary-General, Mark Rutte, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, as aiming at 5%. So if nations are saying we're definitely going to get to 3% by 2034, in 9 years' time, and you've already got the head of NATO talking about 5%, you can see there's an interesting tension. Now, some member states will get at 2 or near 5% because they are near Russia and very, very concerned.
Poland is an example.
But most Western states won't.
I mean, it's really difficult to have this conversation as individual states. I know you're not going to like that, but since all European nations are responding to America basically stepping away, they need to have the conversation together, and there's no point one of them outstripping another in a way, because it's just going to create the same imbalances that have kind of rendered it slightly spinning in the first place.
Let's focus a little bit more about what they're saying about the change in threat. Because again, if we look at the front page there, they go with it too. Cyber hackers will be deployed to fight drones on battlefield, a new era for warfare. Look, the money discussion is going to go on for years, probably until 2034. But it's interesting that they're outlining the change in threat.
Yeah, and hacking is a really interesting thing. It's a bit like the kind of is it a terrorist or a freedom fighter, depending on your point of view. Hacking is fine when your side does it, and when the other side does it as a kind of criminal illegality. And I heard some Canadians talking about their kind of likely hostility with the US in coming years, with the US basically trying to turn them into a 51st state. And they were saying some nation somewhere has to jump first and say, OK, hacking is not just legal, it's not just informally fine. This is the place to come if you're good at it.
And GCHQ has been fishing in those waters for a while, I think. But look, sometimes the tech is ahead of the market, and you have to educate the market about what your product can do before people will buy it. But sometimes the policy is behind the reality. And I think the eye is saying here is interesting, but it's actually in some ways behind what's already occurring. Because in Ukraine, cyber hackers are centrally involved in seeking to stymie Russia's capabilities.
Speaking of Ukraine, if we look at the front page of the Daily Telegraph, I mean, a story again that highlights how much the world has changed and how it's likely to change even more. Get real about US abandoning Ukraine. So this is British and French officials drawing up plans for the coalition of the willing peacekeeping force in Ukraine. They've discussed the need to get real about Donald Trump effectively pulling out.
I'm so unwilling to just move on from the disgrace that this is, because Donald Trump came into power as president saying, I could sort this out in a day.
Never said which day.
He made a fool of himself. A fool of himself, thinking that he'd swung Vladimir Putin or influenced him in some way to do parading on the world stage as though he'd brokered a deal which Putin was not on board with. And now, the British and the French are kind of acting like Donald Trump having attention deficit disorder and backing away is somehow priced in. But I'm just not willing to price that in. We've got to linger on the fact that he causes huge instability and cannot enact anything he says.
I absolutely accept everything you say, that President Trump should not, of course, abandon Ukraine, but it's still reasonable of allies and people in Ukraine, most of all, to think, what if he did, and what would we do? It would be exceptionally difficult for Britain and France to make up the gap, not least because some of that gap is supplied by intelligence, US satellite information and materials, some of which have been piggybacking off of Starlink, so it can be switched off by Elon Musk very quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, what would the alternative be to using Starlink? Is there an alternative?
I don't think there's anything as robust and in place. There's plenty of people who say they can do these capabilities, but it's what's happening now is it's off Starlink.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there and move on, but we will, of course, be discussing this again, and we're expecting the announcement to be made possibly on Monday. We'll see. And coming up, we'll be discussing this story on the front of The Guardian with the headline, claims Musk used drugs during White House. So we'll be discussing that next.
Turkey is burying its dead.
Whole families died in this collapse. Generations wiped out. I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
Anyone could say, I'll do that, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Pushing forward, trying to get people to disperse.
What Prince Harry wanted to do was to eject me.
Is that your opinion?
It is. It is.
They were serious, coordinated attacks.
It's an entire generation that will have to contend with the horrifying impacts of this conflict.
The number of patients is increasing.
It's been quite some day.
Hey, what country are you
From the UK.
Why don't you go back to your country?
You've gone viral.
I've ever had such a reaction.
It's just incredible.
Since the Oval Office meeting, have they reached out to you?
If Ukraine asks for help and its allies decide to help, then that's the end of it.
Criticism of you, the president, is banned. How is this a fair election?
Historic day here today.
Beth Rigby from Sky.
You said to people, I'm not coming back for more, but you have come back for more.
There could be some more painful decisions to come.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world.
I'm Deborah Haynes, Sky security and defence editor. I've covered Russia's full-scale war since it began, witnessing the terror and the trauma.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin. Sky News, get the full story first.
I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege. I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent. Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's futures.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away.
So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Jubilation in the streets, while some emotional.
This is a political victory for Prime Minister Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi. Companies like these are helping India in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration. Sky News, get the full story first.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now in the studio, Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and PR consultant Alex Dean. Alex, why don't you start us on the story from the Daily Telegraph. Their headline, foreigners claim £1 billion a month in benefits. What are the details here?
Well, it's following up, actually, on an earlier pursuit the Telegraph had made on their claims that the government intends, through Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves, to make it much harder for people who are not from this country to claim universal credit and to access the NHS and to access state pensions. They've then worked with a former minister in the Conservative Party's last government, Neil O'Brien, to do some research about households where at least one household member is a foreign national claiming benefits. And that figure has doubled in the last 3 years to 1 billion. But it is not accurate, in my view, to say that foreigners are therefore claiming 1 billion a month in benefits, because some of those households may well be mixed nationality households. So I'm not sure that the headline is right. But there's two other things I think are interesting. The first is quite how significant that jump is. So 8 weeks of these payments to households with at least one foreigner in the household on benefits wipes out what Labour gained from scrapping winter fuel benefits. So just 8 weeks does that. The second thing is that the Telegraph carries on its front page criticism from within the Labour Party, from Graham Stringer, saying how much the difficulties the nation faces means we shouldn't be prioritising giving money to foreign people.
Graham Stringer is a blowhard who doesn't belong in the Labour Party, A. And B, if you actually read the Telegraph story, it says you become entitled to universal credit when you are granted indefinite leave to remain or asylum. Now, the fact that it's gone up quite fast is probably because the asylum system is working slightly better than it was under the Tories and a little bit faster. But seriously, at some point, if you're going to grant people asylum, you have to treat them like citizens of the country. You just have to. You can't go through life going, oh, you're still not British, I'm afraid. You've waited so long for your asylum claim, but you still can't be British. At some point, you have to accept that people are citizens of your nation.
You couch it as if it's a part of political criticism.
No,
the doubling's happened over 3 years, the majority of which the Conservative Party was in power. If there is a party at fault,
I thought it happened over 1 year.
Over 3 years. Right, so it's at least...
Well, in that case, it's no big deal.
Well, I think it is quite a big deal when it goes up this quickly.
No, look, it's literally just people's entitlement once their status changes. And, as you say, you don't necessarily know with the composition of the House who's claiming the benefit. But obviously, people's entitlement is going to change as their status changes. That's the point of status.
But the interesting thing about it is we got this leaked memo. Whoops, how did that get out? From Angela Rayner criticising the high rates of recipients, of foreign nationals getting benefits. Now, one might well think that Angela Rayner is on manoeuvres and that's why you get material like this. But there is this, not just, you don't like Graham Stringer, so therefore the point's invalid.
I really don't.
And I understand that. But, when the Deputy Prime Minister is briefing the Prime Minister in a memo that this is a cause of real concern for Labour core voters, it's not just a minority or fringe interest within government.
I mean, I don't think this is Angie's politics. So whoever did leak it, I don't think it was.
Zoe, we've got a minute 30. Let's look at this
let's go for this.
Front page of The Guardian again. Claims Musk used drugs during White House role. Tell us more about the story, because he wasn't actually asked during the whole Oval Office sort of news conference, and he batted it away because he says the New York Times has been discredited.
Well, I mean, that's actually classic tactics from both Musk and Trump, is when they get anything from a news source they don't like, they just discredit the news source, and it can't be discredited. Furthermore, what's really interesting is when you look at these claims, people in Musk's team were taking pictures of his pill box. So the New York Times has identified some of the pills as Adderall, which isn't a controlled substance. Yeah. But they've got amazingly well-sourced people in his team saying that he took ketamine, he took mushrooms, he took ecstasy. He was regularly, apparently he has bladder problems already, which is what young people get when they take way too much ketamine. So you're really looking at quite a kind of... of course these are allegations.
Yeah, just to say, he was asked, he didn't comment on it.
But they are the same allegations that have been around since before, during the election. And the interesting thing for me is that people are unwilling quite often to pursue well-sourced stories that are widely gossiped around in political circles. The first time a lot of people in politics heard these rumours was not when the New York Times ran it. It was some time before.
But I thought that Musk had actually freely described his ketamine use.
He mentioned some of his ketamine use. The ecstasy and magic mushroom stuff is
brand new. Yeah, I mean, look, he's obviously. I mean, he's quite an unstable person, whether he's on drugs or not.
It'll be interesting to
right?
see what his role continues to be now that he's no longer officially with Doge. We're going to have to leave it there. Alex Dean, Zoe Williams, thank you so much. We'll see you in the next hour. And now let's take a quick look at the weather.